In this video, we're going to be talking about consumer surplus, producer surplus, and economic welfare. Note that I've already stated here that consumer surplus, which we'll be calling CS going forward, plus producer surplus, which we'll be calling PS going forward, is equal to economic welfare, which we will be calling W or just welfare going forward. So let's go ahead and define some things in this video and show visually as well as verbally and with written words here what these terms are. So we're going to start with consumer surplus. Now, consumer surplus shows the gain to consumers. So gain to consumers. You can also think about it as well-being of consumers in this market. Now, the consumer surplus shows us the difference. This is the difference between what the consumer is willing and able to pay, what the consumer is willing and able to pay. You should remember this phrase from your principles of econ. Willing and able to pay here refers to the demand curve versus is the difference between what they're willing and able to pay and the price they actually pay. They actually pay. Now, note here that we highlighted willing and able to pay. The demand curve shows this. So the demand curve shows us for every quantity, this is what the market is willing to pay, PQ, right? The consumers in the market are willing to pay. And as we move along this demand curve, we see what they're willing and able to pay, what they can afford really, but really what they're willing and able to pay for the good. Now, we want to see what that surplus will be in the markets. Remember, we're dealing with competition or perfectly competitive markets. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like visually. So we have this graph here. We have price, quantity, and we have our demand curve. Now, let's assume that in this market, price is set at $25. And here, this intercept here is 50. Right? We don't have an equation, we're just putting numbers in here. If we had an equation, we would be able to tell that number. All right, so we see here that what the consumer is willing and able, first of all, before we even get that deep, let's note that this is going to be the Q, quantity in the market. Okay? Because this is the quantity for this price. For this price, at the price of $25, the quantity in the market is going to be 50. Okay? The demand curve shows us the quantity for a given price, right? That they are willing and able to buy. So for a given quantity, we know what they're willing and able to pay. Same thing. All right, so at this point here, we see that the difference between what the consumer is willing and able to pay, so we go along this demand curve all the way to point A. So for every single unit that is sold along this demand curve, this is, okay, at this price of 25, people are willing to pay $50 and less as we go down. All right. But they only had to pay $25, which means that this entire area here, this triangle, is our consumer surplus. Now, the area of a triangle is equal to half of base times height. Notice that a triangle is just basically half of a square. So if the area of a square is length times breadth, we're saying half of that. The reason why we use base and height for a triangle is because of this middle line. We want to know that we're focusing on the outsides of it. Okay, that's just a quick tidbit for you. All right, so now that we have our triangle, right? This is our triangle. Here our consumer surplus area. The difference between what they're willing and able to pay versus what they actually pay. Consumer surplus. So this would be, for this example, half times our base would be this base of 50. So it goes from 0 to 50, right? 50 units are sold. Times our height. This would be our height. It goes from 25 to 50. So this is 0. So we have times 50 minus 25. So this is equal to half times 50 times 25, right? So this is going to end up being equal to $625. This is the gain to consumers for participating in this market. Right? They were willing and able to pay $625 more than they actually had to pay. Let's write that down. Willing and able. Consumers were willing and able to pay $625 more than they actually had to pay in total. Okay, so now let's look at the producer. On the other hand, producer surplus, new page, producer, okay, that's fine. Producer surplus, as you can imagine, shows us the, so if consumer surplus shows us the gain to consumers and the well-being of consumers, the producer surplus is going to show us, yep, the gain to producers or the well-being of producers from trade. Now, note that they have to be trading to have some sort of producer surplus. So we're going to be looking at variable costs, that is avoidable costs. We'll talk about this a little bit more. Actually, let's do it right now. All right, so what are we trying to say here? If producer surplus is the difference, between what producers are willing and able to collect. In other words, this is the minimum they will accept, minimum amount that the seller producer must receive. Bear with me here. I'm reading and typing and thinking at the same time. Must receive to be willing to produce. So it needs to cover their avoidable costs. Remember we talked about this in the last chapter. To produce. So it's the difference between what they're willing and able to collect, or the minimum amount they must receive for them to be willing to produce, and the amount they actually get. Okay, now we need to note some things. Note that the supply curve which is actually, right, the marginal cost curve above the minimum average variable cost, right? So once we're dealing with the marginal cost curve above minimum average variable cost, In other words, we talked about this in the last videos as well. If they produce marginal cost AVC anywhere lower than this, then when P is equal to MC here, they're not even able to cover their variable costs, avoidable costs, let alone their unavoidable costs. So they will always produce at some point where they can always cover, at the very least, their average variable cost. Okay, so we've said all of that. And we know the marginal cost curve is the supply curve. So, I kind of gave away the supply curve is the marginal cost curve. Excuse me. So, we can see what that is like visually, but I want to note something here. Now, we know that producer surplus is the gain from trading, right? So what that means is that producer surplus, actually I'm going to write it out. Therefore, producer surplus does not account for the cost that would occur even without production, aka fixed cost. So when we're saying the producer surplus, we're not accounting for fixed costs because the producer will have to pay this regardless of production. Therefore, producer surplus is equal to profit plus fixed cost. Okay. This is a lot of words here. All we're trying to say is that producer surplus will only be equal to our profits if fixed cost is equal to 0. Then producer surplus will be equal to profit. All right, so let's come back to our original discussion of producer surplus and how to identify it visually. So we have an area, price, quantity. Remember, this is a market. And this time we care about the supply curve, right? Supply curve. Note that this is also the marginal cost curve, but we'll call that supply. So let's assume that in this market, price is different market. Price is 10. Actually, let's be consistent. So this point here is 0. The price in the previous market was 25, so let's do 25 here. So producer surplus, just make sure we're consistent with the color. Okay. So producer surplus will be the difference between what the minimum that the producer has to receive in order to produce, which is shown by this marginal cost curve or supply curve above AVC, versus what they actually get from production. That kind of sounds like profit, right? Where you see whatever it costs to produce versus what you get in from selling. Now, we just talked about how the only way producer surplus is equal to profit has to do with fixed cost being equal to 0. But let's come back to this. Producer surplus will be this entire triangle here, which shows us the space or the distance between the cost of production. So if we were to show our quantity produced here, right, this is the quantity that's going to be supplied at that price. So Q supplied, right? So for the quantity produced here, we have this cost as a section. So this lower triangle will basically be the cost, and it's the variable cost. It doesn't account for the fixed cost yet, which is why when we say that producer surplus is the area between what the producer, the minimum the producer is willing to accept versus what they actually get. We highlight the fact that for this to be equal to profits, then fixed cost must be 0. I've said that a number of times because it's a question I've received from a number of students when describing producer surplus. So again, producer surplus is the supply curve. So it's above supply curve, below and below price in market. So it's the area, right? Now this is a triangle as well. So we know the area of the triangle is equal to half base times height. So we have half times, this is our base. Okay, this is our height. The market quantity is 50. All right, so half of our base just goes from 0 to 50, right? It's equal at the top and the bottom, right? So 0 to 50, so we have times 50 times our height from 0 to 25, so 25 minus 0. So we have half of 50 times 25, which again will be 625. So if we're describing this in words, and this is producer surplus, we would say, again, it's similar to what we said for the consumer surplus. Producers are willing to accept $625 less than they actually received in the market. Now, notice that this amount is the same. This 625 is equal for producer is equal to the 625 for consumer. It doesn't have to be that way. It just happens to be with the numbers we used. Now we're going into the territory of economic welfare. We've looked at producer surplus separate from consumer surplus. Now we have economic welfare. So economic welfare combines both consumer surplus and producer surplus, in that it's equal to consumer surplus plus producer surplus. The way we've entered these two things in this equation implies that we give consumers and producers equal value when considering their gain from participating in the market. Okay. All right. So let's draw this out. We have this market, P on the and Q down here. We have the market, some market, let's say market for jeans, and we have the demand curve, we have the supply curve, and this here is 50, this here is 0. The point where they intersect is our competitive equilibrium. At competitive equilibrium, that should be a triangle. So that we get our P star and Q star, right? Remember that from your principles. P star and Q star is the price that sets quantity demanded equal to quantity supplied. So we have that as 50 and we have this as 25. So you can pause the video here and try to figure out where producer surplus will be and where consumer surplus will be. Okay. All right. So remember, consumer surplus is the difference between what the consumers are willing and able to pay, which is shown by that demand curve, and what they act for that quantity 50, and what they actually pay for that quantity 50. So we have this upper triangle here as our consumer surplus, and producer surplus, on the other hand, is the difference between the minimum amount that the producers must receive in order to produce in this market versus what they actually get. Right, so this is the minimum amount they'll be willing to accept versus what they actually get in the market. So this lower triangle here is the producer surplus. Notice that this is all for quantity 50, our equilibrium quantity. So that means, putting all of this together, that our welfare will be this huge triangle. So the combination of producer surplus and consumer surplus. All right, that's all I have for this video. If you have any questions about this, feel free to reach out. Good job watching this. I will see you in the next video.